Hi, welcome to another session, Searching for Answers, the program where we dig into the text to learn all we can about its original setting and meaning and how it applies in our lives today. We are working our way through the book of Esther. We've gotten well into it with one session, and we pick up now the thread of this fascinating, glamorous, but also deeply troubling story. So while you grab your Bibles, let me invite my good colleagues to introduce themselves.
Bernard Taylor, Loma Linda University Church, retired.
Catherine Coe, La Sierra University.
And I'm John Jones, La Sierra University. This book just doesn't waste time, does it? It gets right in to the thick of things. We're only through the first few verses, 3 or 4 paragraphs in the first chapter, and already the plot is taking shape, isn't it? Here is this picture painted of a time when the Hebrew people are captive. They're strangers in a strange land, a land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers we know as Iran today. But this is a real challenge to their cultural identity, to their faith, to the principles of their religion, and to the values that they hold dear. It's not easy. After all, this is an empire that stretches all the way from Egypt all the way over to India. 180 days of celebration across the eastern side of the then known world, so to speak. And somehow Xerxes needs to kind of establish his street cred among all of the people, and particularly among his intermediaries, the administrators who run the local satrapies or areas, regions. And so he throws a banquet, a celebration, in fact, that lasts, we say, for these 180 days that the chapter tells us, culminating in a steady week of constant banqueting. Oh dear. We can think of all kinds of problems, can't we, with this? And at the end of the week comes a particular scene where the king decides the way to top off this whole thing is to manifest his trophy wife. What happens?
Disaster. And at the expense of appearing to wallow in all of this,
yeah,
it is important to note the story as it unfolds, that we have the details of the decorating of the banquet, the colors, the expense, and all the rest of it. I don't know that there's anything else like this in the canonical text. We're in an alien land, and this is the background which will become the foreground as the story unfolds. Within this context, what an alien atmosphere. What good can possibly come from this? Who cares? What's all this about? But stay tuned, as it were.
Yeah.
And let the story unfold and then see where it goes from there. But the culminating act, although the text seems to imply a measure of spontaneity in this, what can I do? What haven't I done? Oh, Vashti. Yeah. Vashti. Bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty. For she was fair to behold. And let me remind you of Ruth.
Yeah.
And I commented there that nowhere in the book was Ruth described. Nothing about her beauty, like we have with Esther here, and the book of Judith in the Apocrypha. Nothing like that for Ruth. And the way I've come to picture it is to be walking behind her and towards the people who are coming our way. And so I can see from the way they look at Ruth, the impact that she has on people coming toward. That's the only indication I have of what she's like. But here in this context, beauty is everything.
Yeah.
And especially at a time like this, and many people have found to their chagrin, men and women, that people don't look the same when sober as they did when drunk. And the attraction of the opposite sex is often described as heightened. I've never experienced it, but that's the context here, and that's what we're inexorably being pushed towards, and this is not going to end well, especially for Vashti.
No, it cannot, really.
It really demonstrates, as you're saying, the values of this particular society. And you contrast that with the God that we worship who cares about what's in the heart. So this is a society that values the outward things very much so, and that's why Vashti was brought in. She wasn't brought in for her witty repartee, right? She's brought in order to be looked at, to be gazed upon.
An object of desire.
Yes.
Yeah.
Katie?
Or at least potentially brought in.
Can you comment on where in the royal pecking order Vashti would be? Because when I see Queen, I instinctively think of like replacing Lady Di when her demise, and that, you know, it may be serial monogamy or whatever it may be, but later, of course, we're going to come into harem. Is this somebody in the harem? And if not, why was she selected for this occasion?
Well, there are levels within the harem. There are concubines, and
Right.
those are the women that the king can summon in order to have relations with him. But they are in a monogamous relationship with the king. In other words, they're monogamous. The
Right.
women are not allowed to be with any other man, but the king is allowed to sort of sample from his harem, as it were. The queen, Vashti, she's sort of at the top of this harem structure. She's the one who has the most power. You see that in that she's also allowed to hold a banquet at the same time as the king, right? So she holds political power and sway, and even potentially the ear of the king. So she's part of the harem, but at the highest levels of it. So, yes.
But not an equal with the king.
Absolutely not. Oh, absolutely not, no.
So here is a woman of principle.
Yes.
We mentioned that last time, but it's easy to tell the story, and it's the book of Esther, and to miss that here is a woman of substance who has her principles, which she will not cross over.
And look at who she's going against. She's going against a king of a vast empire.
Right.
It goes from India to Kush, so India to Egypt. I mean, this is a massive swath of land. And he's someone who's known for his temper, as we mentioned previously. He's someone who likes large parties, and he owns a very lavish palace. So this is a wealthy man, and this is a powerful man, and she's willing to say no to him. And that's what makes, I believe, her act so courageous. But I think it also explains his anger, because he's looking at her and thinking, you're going to embarrass me? You're going to say no to the man who owns all of this and does all of this? There's definitely ego that comes into play in this particular part of the story.
Yeah, the purpose of this whole exercise, after all, is to kind of build him up and establish his authority and power and credibility. And now he can't even control the women in his own household. This whole thing, this whole scene, starting from these 180 days of festivity, is about to be threatened and lost in this process, isn't it? Given that patriarchal world in which they all lived at that time. So we read here in verse 13 of chapter 1, it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law, and justice. And so he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to him. Apparently he has 7 people who are sort of consultants or advisors, And they're named here: Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan. Memucan is named last because he's going to play the decisive role in this thing. Yeah. So we just to finish off the verse there, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. So he naturally turns to them first. Okay, so he asks them the question in verse 15, according to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. There's the question. There's the problem. Now, what happens? Pick up on this, if you will, Kathleen, and take us further. Catherine.
Then Memucan replied, in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord.
Oh dear. Yeah, no, clearly, this is the implication, isn't it? Yeah. Take us on down through the end of the chapter, and then let's talk about this.
Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his own household.
And king of his own palace, so to speak, metaphorically. But I think Memucan, this easily could have wound up with Vashti losing her head, not just her position.
Yes.
That he apparently does not advise, for whatever reasons. But she is fully deposed. No question about that. Make a clear statement. What do you think?
It's interesting. 2 letters in Aramaic as in English. No. And all of this happened. And the whole world of the men falls apart.
That's all it takes.
That's all it takes. A no from a woman, and said in such a way that no is realized to be no. Not all men are able to hear that, but in this situation it occurs. And then they're left with the problem. Oh, what do we do now? And of course, there couldn't be a vacant room, presumably, and so now this whole process is taken up. It's I almost want to say a spoof, and maybe that is the word on power. Reminds me of 1 Samuel 12, where Samuel lays out what a kingdom will be like, and having a king and being like the nation. It's remarkable in its insights. And here we have a woman of principle, and the whole world of the men begins to shake and to be at risk of collapsing, and they have to go into council. What do we do when a woman says no? And essentially he says, well, first you respect it, then you find a replacement. Your decision. It's
Who's in charge around here finally?
It's an interesting story, the way that it's told, and what it describes, and how easy it is to relate to it, especially with that much wine and feasting and all the rest of it. Principle is gone, but there were those who did understand and could offer surprisingly good advice. It's
I wonder if the 7 wise men were required to be the designated sober advisors.
yes, so somebody could be able
Responsible.
to, responsibility in the face of all of that.
And gender politics aside, I think that this is almost a playbook of what you do with a tyrant. She says no. She doesn't go and storm the party and stage a coup of the king. She says no. And this enrages him. I think it's actually, like you said, this is a woman of substance. This is a woman of character. She's going to stand where she's standing, and she's not going to be moved. And I think that that's beautiful, particularly for people who are faced with any kind of situation in which they feel that maybe their ethics or their morals are not being, their values are being threatened. What a great example of what to do in that situation. All you have to say is no.
Boy, there's a lesson already. I think we've gotten our money's worth out of this book already, haven't we? Huh?
Yeah.
Yes.
So here we are. We ask ourselves the question, how does this story resonate? And we'll need to ask that much more as we work through it. But when we think of the Hebrew people telling this story, repeating it, reading it, recounting it to generations down the path of history, we lay it down alongside not only Ruth, which we've been looking at, but also Daniel, the interaction between value systems, cultural practices and understandings. In the case of Daniel, the Hebrews are shown to be superior to the king's finest. There it's in terms not only of how they look, it says they look better, the Hebrews youth, but that they were smarter and able to somehow command intelligence among themselves, and that's impressive from the male side. Now we're going to see a setup in which also the women apparently are able to outclass the competition as well. Here is a story that tells the Hebrew people, we don't seem like much. We are kind of negligible. We don't really matter very much in the eyes of other cultures, societies, and above all of our captors. But you know what? We're as good as they are, and maybe a little bit better. We can outdo them at their own game a bit. Interesting twist for a people who have experienced the humiliation of captivity. These stories stiffen their spines up, and they stand a little taller in some way. Now, I gotta wonder, when Hebrews tell this story in subsequent generations to one another, to themselves, if it doesn't also have a little bit of a sly wink and a bit of a chuckle about it. Here's this king, so foolish. He's only been in power a couple, 3 years, and yeah, look how silly he is. You know, you got to wonder if there isn't a bit of a nudge and a wink about all of that as well. Now I'm laying my trip on the text to be sure, but we may have other moments to think about that.
And I think that's an interesting literary device that may be being used here.
Yes.
And for historians of 18th century France, for example, they'd use the term a trickster tale, in which you have a setup in which there's a typical hierarchy, a boss and an apprentice, a king and a peasant, for example. And the peasant or the apprentice somehow, through their wits or through chance, are able to kind of turn the tables on this traditional hierarchy of what's going on. So what you have in the book of Esther is there's a turning of the tables from what is previously established and understood.
So if we stay with the classic French model, the emperor turns out not to have clothes.
Precisely.
And we'll see some moments here that move that direction.
Yes.
Yeah, so you have little tailors who turn out to be dragon slayers and so forth.
Absolutely.
Well, it's an old model, but it's apparently a powerful one because this is a rattling good yarn, isn't it? And it has a certain punch to it.
And it serves a purpose of demonstrating covenant
Yeah.
and how God can use a trickster, someone who is the least of these, not just a Hebrew in a foreign land, a woman, and not just a woman, an orphan who's being raised by her cousin in order to do something great for his people.
The Gideon story,
Yeah.
not by might nor by power, you know, faith does matter. So, Mordecai is going to turn out to be clever. Esther herself is no slouch. She is more than a pretty face. We'll see. Now, of course, this is going to raise for us questions of Esther's opportunism, but hey, if there is divine guidance, even if the name of God isn't mentioned, you kind of bracket those questions finally, don't you? Yeah. Well,
it's interesting the further information about the empire. When it comes to sending it out, they send to each in their own language. And,
yes.
And this is a sophisticated operation, and they have apparently appropriate officials for different cultural groups and language groups and all the rest of it. And we will have occasion to visit in future stories, future chapters, some of the things that we have commented. You mentioned the book of Daniel. Esther will reach different conclusions to what Daniel did relative to food, for instance. And God meets them where they are and deals with them in the different situations. And it's not one size fits all. And here, despite all the obstacles, there is the progression through the story and the doing what is right in the face of great odds, but recognizing that who knows, but you're sent to the kingdom for such a time as this.
Just going
Diversity matters.
Yes.
Sorry, just going off of what you were saying about the system that they have for letters and a communication system, as it were. There's archaeological evidence. We discussed a little bit of this in the last episode, but there's archaeological evidence for that as well. There's a beautiful alabaster jar from Egypt that's found, I believe, in the British Museum that has inscribed on it the name of King Xerxes I, and it's in a number of different languages. It's in cuneiform, it's also in hieroglyphs. There's different languages that are represented on this alabaster jar with the king's name on it. And so this system that's being talked about here was something that was set in place. It was there, and it's historical. It's something that we can look at and say, well, that could have definitely happened. This is not improbable. This is actually just how communications in that kingdom worked.
Well, my goodness, if they know each man's drinking preferences, they're going to know something about his language and culture and background, and the particular kind of value system that the different parts of the empire represent. A long time ago, a wise man in China by the name of Lao Tzu said, when you rule a complex kingdom, don't fuss with it too tightly and too much. Rule it a little bit lightly, a little loosely. The way he put it was, as you would fry a small and delicate fish. Don't turn it over too many times, or it'll fall apart. Well, there may be some conventional wisdom about that reaches beyond China. Interesting piece of business. So here we are, chapter 2. After a while, the king settles down, and when his anger subsides, he remembers Vashti. He gets to thinking, oh dear, maybe he's been without a wife too long. He's starting to think about this whole situation, what she's done and what he's done, in effect. chapter 2, verse 1.
And it creates a power vacuum in the court as well, because
It seems,
as we'd mentioned
yeah.
previously, you have this harem system in which you have concubines and you have a queen who's set above the others. And with no queen, because Vashti's been deposed, she's been taken down a few notches, as it were, you need someone to fulfill that role. And so he's needing that role fulfilled.
Yeah. And it's created a hole. There's a lack there.
Definitely.
And he's gotten to thinking about all of this when he's able to think about it with a clearer head.
Now, presumably, Vashti went through a process similar to what is about to be gone through, and she stood out above all of the rest. There was something about her. She knew who she was. She could make decisions. And her banquet apparently was running well. She was... and then she's gone, and nobody's in that position. And he doesn't know. He can't do it.
Yeah.
He wants to give that power to eunuchs.
Yeah.
So,
The time has come.
yeah.
And maybe you don't want the current concubines fighting amongst themselves over who's going to be the next queen. And so I think that possibly could play into this process that we're about to look at.
All these stories coming out of the Middle East and beyond. Harems are places of intrigue.
Absolutely.
And pretty fierce competition.
Particularly in the Ottoman Empire in the medieval period, you have situations very similar to this.
Well, you know, I think this all washed out into the families of these women, back out in what villages they come from. It's a way of advancing your whole clan group, for example. Again, in India and in China as well, we have clear stories about the motive behind all of this cutthroat competition. It's for their own, to advance their own families in power as well. So yeah, it's, and then you get the eunuchs involved in the whole thing. The potential for a real circus is there, isn't it? Yeah. So at this point in our conversation, we have to just note that the king has kind of simmered down a little bit, maybe gotten a little perspective on things, a little critical distance, I don't know. But his courtiers now recognize that this is the opportunity to step in and make another suggestion and say, okay, now we've got some water under the bridge. Where do we go from here? And so in a brief word, just as we close here, what's the suggestion?
Let's find a new one.
Yeah, here we go again. Let's go through this whole process all over again. Here is where the story is set up. We know nothing of Vashti's cultural, ethnic, tribal background at all. But we're going to know in her replacement, where it becomes so vital to the story. Here is someone who is of a piece with her people, clearly, from the beginning. Raised as she was by Mordecai, now it's her turn to see what she can do for her people. And we'll look at that next time on Searching for Answers.